We are going to talk about how the war divides America. We're going to talk about the domino theory, although it's going to be a very light discussion because obviously we've talked about the domino theory like 80 times now. We'll talk about Vietnam, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, Operation Rolling Thunder, which is, a cool name for a pretty awful thing. Americanizing the war, and then the limited war as well. Some of this stuff is from yesterday, so maybe we don't touch on it too much, or from the other day. Some of the stuff is from day 3, but we will hit the major things for the day, which one of the biggest things that we're talking about today is just the fact that this war is incredibly dividing in America. You have people on either side. It's like you're either incredibly pro-war or you're incredibly against the war. Yes, there's people in the middle, but the most vocal of the two sides are obviously very pro or very against. It opens up this rift in American society. Make no mistake, World War II, it's like a lot of people are like, they just attacked Pearl Harbor? Like, I will go kill Hitler today, right? That's everybody during World War II. Well, a lot of people at least. Vietnam, they're like, you want me to go to where? I actually don't know where that's at, right? I don't know where Vietnam is. You gave somebody a map back then and you're like, show me Vietnam. They're going to be like, there, right? Because they have no idea, okay? Yeah. A lot of people don't quite know. Yeah. So that's part of the reason also when people don't quite understand, like, what the hell is the point, right? That is part of it. Opening up a rift in American society. So we have these guys or girls or whoever, the Hawks, right? They're for the war. They're the Hawks. They're incredibly pro-war. And then on the other side, we have the Doves. And the Doves are against the war, right? They couldn't have picked a better name, I don't think. The Hawks believe that due to the aggression of the North Vietnamese, it was forced into the war, right? They're saying that the North Vietnamese, the aggression, they're probably relying on a lot of things like domino theory, heavy issues of the spread of communism, and they're saying that the North Vietnamese aggression and their push to take over the southern area of Vietnam is forcing the United States into war. The Doves, on the other hand, viewed the issues of Vietnam as a problem more akin to a civil war, North versus South, and not necessary for the U.S. to be involved. That's the two kind of camps, okay? The draft, it becomes unpopular. Now, if you remember, in World War II, people are they're like, yeah, I'm 18, right? They're like 3 feet tall and 12 years old, and they're like, I will go, right? That's not necessarily happening here with Vietnam. Now, I'm sure it happens for some, but this is not nearly as popular of a war. So before 1965, volunteers, a lot of them, right? After 1965, we're starting to see 1.5 million people being drafted, and that is not a popular concept. In fact, the draft is one of the biggest reasons why so many people hate the war, right? We'll let the U.S. go and do whatever it wants in all these other countries, but the minute that you're like, you have to go do it, yeah, people are like, oh, whoa, right? So that's definitely a huge reason there. All males had to register by the time they were 18. You have different things like deferment, so there are some reasons why you might not go. Stuff like being a college student. If I was a college student during the time, I'd probably be like, I'm going to stay for 10 years, right? And to those who work certain occupations, maybe school teachers or whoever, right? Most of the 2.5 million men who served in Vietnam came from working class or poorer backgrounds. That means that there are a lot of rich individuals who are finding their way to, conveniently being excluded from the draft. And we'll talk about some either rich individuals. We'll also talk about some pretty well-known draft dodgers. What is a draft dodger? What does it mean to dodge the draft?
Someone who doesn't go to war, or someone who doesn't show up for drafting papers or stuff like that,
yeah,
Muhammad Ali.
Yeah, exactly, and we'll talk about him a little bit. So it's like ways that people are avoiding the draft, like they're just not going, and it is technically your legal obligation. Like if you avoid the draft, you can get jail time, you can get fined, you can all this stuff, right? So this is a variety of ways that people are avoiding, service in the armed forces during the draft years, and this is something that we see from a lot of popular individuals. I know we talked about, Sky mentioned Muhammad Ali, and we'll talk about him in a minute, but what we see is, you could be a conscientious objector. Has anybody ever seen the movie Hacksaw Ridge? if you remember in that movie, now not everybody's seen it, but that's dealing with like World War II. He, during the draft, like, and also like he was like involving himself in the military on purpose. They were like, no, you're a conscientious objector. Like, what are you doing here? Does anybody know what a conscientious objector would be, or what it would relate to? Maybe, right? What's the big theme in Hacksaw Ridge? Like, what's his big background?
He doesn't hurt anybody.
And why?
What'd
What'd you say? He is. But it relates back to, what do you think it probably relates back to?
The cross.
The cross. Religion, right? So it gets into this idea of religion. In Hacksaw Ridge, I don't remember what his exact religion is. I think he might be Christian or Catholic, or maybe he's something else. What is he, do you know? Yeah, so one of those two, or maybe he's something different. But either way, a conscientious objector is somebody who, based on their religion, like a Jehovah's Witness, a Mennonite, the Amish, Quakers, these are all considered peace churches who are opposed to any kind of military service. So that is something that maybe people would call back on. You know, I'm a conscientious objector. It does not fit in my religion. I will not go to war, right? I will not raise a rifle. Thou shalt not kill, all that good stuff, right? Other people, to avoid being drafted, would do literally anything and everything, including staying awake for like days at a time so that they get there and they're all like insane while they're talking to the person who's doing the draft interview or whoever is doing their screening. Doing a lot of illegal drugs was a huge thing. I believe Ted Nugent made a claim that he like did meth before his draft day interview or something. And then also apparently he like pooped his pants. I don't know. Apparently that's a thing. That is what he said in his interview, not making that up. Making themselves unhealthy enough to avoid being drafted or making up a health condition. So you could either actually be unhealthy or you could just be like, I'm unhealthy, right? And if you could forge or get like a doctor's note or something that actually worked with that, then you could get out of it. Or some people would go as far as to give themselves something like hepatitis or to induce something like an ulcer or anemia if they could. You know, they're common treatable conditions that the military will flat out reject you for having. And then additionally, diabetics also were often rejected in the draft during this time. Given the nature of societal context during the time as well, and the culture shift that we've obviously experienced today, but back then it was not the same. So being a homosexual, if you aren't a homosexual, some people would, you know, make up that they were, all simply to get out of the draft. Now, legitimate and illegitimate, many people pretended to be either way, and many people were excluded for that reason. Many draft dodgers also fled to Canada between 65 and 75. We have a lot of famous draft dodgers like Muhammad Ali. He claimed conscientious objection, even though he himself recognized that the religion of Islam didn't really fall into the category of peace religions like the others that were mentioned. Bill Clinton pretended to join the ROTC, a college-based military officer training program, got away with it that way. Bruce Springsteen, born in the USA. Yeah, everybody always plays that song at like July 4th parties and stuff, and it's really not like a pro-USA song. It's especially talking about, you know, a lot of the stuff that's happening during this time. That's obviously not his only claim to fame. He's got plenty of songs, but Bruce Springsteen, you know, very vocal against the war effort. Mitt Romney fled to Europe to work as a missionary, returned to the U.S. when he deemed it was safe. I think Mitt Romney maybe has ties to Mormonism, so there was something going on there with his religion. And then Donald Trump, a lot of claims that he made up a fake foot injury to avoid the draft or something like bone spurs, whatever it might be, right? So that all happens. A lot of different ways that people avoid the draft. You're going through the mail and one day you're like, oh my gosh, I got a letter from the President of the United States. What could it be? And then all of a sudden the president's like, I need you, right? He pulls out the whole Uncle Sam and he's like, you are going to fight for me, right? Unless you can show me all of the things that I just mentioned, right? So either way, you know, a lot of people are like dreading that they're going to get something like this in the mail. Now, people were still afraid of being drafted during World War II, but like nowadays, like, well, not nowadays, but in the 60s and looking at Vietnam, people are way less on board with potentially being drafted. And part of the reason is, well, World War II happened. You have a lot of a different generation from that going forward. And then you had the Korean War happen. There's a lot of war that's been happening during these times. And then all of a sudden, you also have like the Cold War and all the proxy wars that are going on there. It's a hectic, a time of a lot of calamity. All right, so people are not nearly as on board as they were in the past. And it's a whole different situation. World War II attack on, technically on U.S. soil, right? This is different. Like I said, a lot of people don't even quite know where Vietnam is or what it's all about. They know that communism's bad, but they don't understand why they need to go there. The Tet Offensive, January 21st. The Tet Offensive is named after the Vietnamese Lunar New Year. It is a Viet Cong assault on 36 provincial capitals in 5 major cities. It's like way down in the south of Vietnam, getting all the way down to the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, which is in the capital. The fighting was fierce. Thousands of communist-backed Viet Cong fighters waged battles in more than 100 locations in the first 24 hours alone. The crazy sneak attack, right? Americans managed to repel the forces. It was technically an American victory. The U.S. won a military victory. However, this offensive itself was perceived negatively by many Americans. It actually became a political disaster for Lyndon Johnson and may have been one of the things that leads him to step down after his 4 years. Tet left many doubting the war's course. It exposed the truth that 3 years of heavy presence, high casualties, and endless fighting in Vietnam had yielded basically no results. Like, where are we going with this war? Why are so many people dying? Why are we being drafted? Like, what is the goal? Like, what do you think the outcome's going to be? Part of this, too, is not understanding, like, how difficult it truly was going to be to fight the Viet Cong. Like, they just completely underestimated them. Make sure you're paying attention to the notes. Everybody looking over the class, I see some of you. The media's coverage of Tet overall, it's honest. It's fair-minded. It's unflinching, right? It shapes America's evolving views that the Vietnam War simply could not be won by this conventional idea, right, by conventional standards. The media also did not shy away from portraying the violence and bloodshed of the war. I mean, a lot of this stuff, it's the same thing that, maybe you're not seeing. I know we have a lot of like World War II in color and stuff like that, but a lot of that footage is coming out way after the fact. Some of this stuff is like in the moment, this happened, this is being reported, we have footage of it, take a look, right? So media is really kind of picking up here. This is what it looks like, the whole Tet Offensive, the Viet Cong moving from North Vietnam, moving through and hitting all these kind of major areas. This is where you have all your major battles, and then all the way down here, all the way to Saigon, where you actually have a U.S. embassy. And this is a big deal to hit Saigon especially, okay? This is what the Tet Offensive looks like. Johnson decides that he's not going to run for a second term. Eugene McCarthy, a Democrat, Robert Kennedy, a Democrat, both make a bid for the presidency. Johnson announced that he would not run for president. However, they make these bids before that. It's pretty weird because that usually doesn't happen. It's odd for members of a president's party to attempt to run against the president. But there's a lot of sentiment during this time that many thought that Johnson might have been pretty unpopular inside the Democratic Party, and therefore it makes sense why he might have faced a pretty strong challenge from Robert Kennedy, who kind of pushes himself out and becomes the forefront leader in this Democratic nomination. Well, we'll get to that as well. So that is what happens here. Johnson stepping down, okay? And that leads us to our next, tragic event. It's just that there's always so many crazy things happening during this time, I swear. I can't even imagine what it was like to live during this time and see. I mean, it's bad enough with our current news cycle, but Martin Luther King Jr., right? Assassinated April 4th, 1968. Robert Kennedy, really young, again, charismatic guy coming out, could be the potential front-running nominee for the Democratic Party to take on whatever Republican candidate they put forward, likely Nixon. He is assassinated at a rally celebrating his victory in the California primary. He's gaining steam. It's different, though. It's not like this isn't related to JFK's, even though they're related by blood. It's not related to JFK's assassination, not similar motives or anything like that. Robert Kennedy is assassinated by Sirhan Sirhan, and he is assassinated by this Palestinian immigrant because, can anybody guess why? Any idea? What's the big conflict with Palestine to this day? Palestine and who? Nobody? No current event readers in here? Nobody's up to date? Palestine and Israel, right? So this is a similar thing. If you remember, after World War II, Israel is reestablished, right, as a new area again, and this leads to a lot of conflict with Palestine, obviously, and still to this day leads to a large amount of conflict. Robert Kennedy is a big proponent of Israel. Now, in the grand scheme of things, Sirhan didn't really do anything besides assassinate Robert Kennedy, because to this day, again, yeah, what has changed? The U.S. is still heavily, a proponent of Israel to this day, right? But that's the big motivation behind Sirhan and his shot and his assassination of Kennedy is because he didn't want like a pro-Israel candidate. Well, here we are. So that happens, and RFK is assassinated as well. All right. The 1968 Democratic Convention. We have anti-war protesters, all of this stuff breaking out, anti-Vietnam, right? The mayor deploys police, the National Guard. There's fighting outside the convention. There is fighting inside the convention among the Democrats. Like, they're going at it because there's two sides to this, all right? You have Hubert Humphrey, who is like the status quo. He is with the war. The big divide in there inside the Democratic Convention is like, what are we going to do with the war? Who are we putting forward? What's the Democratic agenda? What is our goal? We all have to be on the same page. Obviously, they're not. There's a lot of crumbling going on inside there. Hubert Humphrey is chosen over Eugene McCarthy. Eugene McCarthy is like starkly anti-war, right? So he's kind of going against the grain with the rest of the party members. On the outside, you have what is called the Battle of Michigan Avenue. Protesters are clashing with police. All this stuff is caught on television. It sparks a large-scale change in American society. And also, many people see this as a turning point in the U.S. view towards the Vietnam, which many felt was now pointless and drawn out and just like, we don't get it, okay?
Do you know if the protest was supposed to be peaceful or not? Do you think it was like supposed to be violent, or was it peaceful?
I'd imagine as many protests start, it wouldn't surprise me if they start off peacefully. But there's also the issue of clashing outside of a Democratic convention, and especially following, the assassination of JFK, the assassination of Robert Kennedy. It also wouldn't surprise me even if they were peaceful, it was going to escalate, because I'm sure that a lot of the police or security in that area were on edge, regardless, with all these different politicians inside. And, with everything that's going on during the time, I mean, I'd have to look into it a little bit more as to like what the intentions were, but I doubt that they went there looking to just immediately start fighting everybody. But it was an anti-war, so a lot of the anti-war movement eventually transitions into that whole make love, not war, right? So those people in general are usually going to be pretty peaceful, but I guess this is probably a bit of a different crowd. So Nixon wins the presidency. Nixon is the guy who comes forward. Now, he almost won, obviously, in 60 against Kennedy. It was really, really close. So it's no surprise that Nixon comes back out. He knew that he's probably not going to win in that election against Johnson, but now he has an opening, right? He has an in. Nixon comes forward. He promises peace with honor. He runs on this platform of, getting the U.S. out of Vietnam. However, with this whole peace with honor thing, he's like, yeah, let's get out of Vietnam. Well, let's see if I can win first. Like, let me just try it, right? Let me try and win, and then we'll leave Vietnam, okay? He wants to listen to the quiet majority. He's looking at the non-shouters and the non-demonstrators, and Nixon wins this presidency relatively handedly. And part of that too is the Democratic Party is shaken up, right? They've been attacked many years, and their leading candidate has now been assassinated. Nixon wins pretty well. He does, face a steeper challenge than like Lyndon Johnson did against Barry Goldwater. But I doubt that there was too many doubts in the minds of most people that Nixon would take this one. Okay. Again, his big thing, he's campaigning on the platform of getting out of Vietnam. All right, the gradual pull out of Vietnam, Vietnamization. The U.S. forces would withdraw as ARVN troops assume more combat duties. It's like the same thing that we're seeing in Afghanistan right now, with the U.S. eventually pulling out of Afghanistan. You could probably make a correlation between the policies, right? The U.S. pulls out, and the troops that are there fighting their own battle, fighting what the Doves would call a civil war, are going to take over the duties that the U.S. troops were using before. Another goal is to reduce the flow of communist supplies to the Viet Cong. what this means is by doing some somewhat shady and non-reported things. And, primarily ordering the bombing of the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Cambodia. This ends up being a big deal, as we'll talk about, because, again, it's not very well known that this is happening to the public. Now, granted, we don't know everything that our government does militarily, obviously, right? But oftentimes when big operations are carried out, it is, especially in, like, one of the most unpopular wars of all time, usually something that's talked about, okay, or reported on. Nixon ordered the bombing of the trail. That's a huge supply route from the north to the south, and it was vital to the communist forces in the south. This bombing, many times based on somewhat iffy intelligence, destroyed 80% of the Cambodian countryside and killed 500,000 plus Cambodians, right? This is not even the worst thing that happens with the U.S. throughout the war, and it gets significantly worse, and we'll talk about that in a moment. American troops in Cambodia, 1970, were ordering a ground attack on the North Vietnamese army and Viet Cong bases in Cambodia. So we're also crossing country lines and going into different countries and engaging the enemy there as well. We're aiding the pro-American Cambodian government against the Khmer Rouge. This is that brutal regime under the leadership of dictator Pol Pot, who later goes on and basically enacts a really horrific genocide on the Cambodian people as well. Their communist movement is supporting the North Vietnam Viet Cong as well. All right, so this is what we have going on here. More kind of images that are photographed of a lot of the terrible, terrible stuff that's happening. Children, civilians, innocent people getting caught in crossfire and sometimes being outrightly targeted. It's just, there's a lot of, war crimes that do happen during this time, and some really specific ones with My Lai that we'll talk about in a little bit. Am I going too fast if I move on? Okay. We see a lot of students getting involved in protests during this time. Kent State, right? Demonstrators are throwing bottles and rocks at National Guards, stuff that you see. I'm not condoning it, but it's nothing quite out of the ordinary for a protest that turns violent, right? One guardsman said that he thought that he heard sniper fire. He fired his rifle. That prompted other National Guardsmen to fire as well. 4 students are killed. This reminds me a lot of like the situation like the Boston Massacre. You guys remember that? Boston Massacre, some people cornered troops, whatever, and then somebody claims that somebody's got a gun or there's a shot fired, somebody gets scared. One person fires, the rest of them fire, and then several people are killed, right? It's kind of something similar. This, in its immediate aftermath, a student-led strike forced the temporary closure of colleges and universities across the country. Some political observers believe the events of that day in Northeast Ohio tilted public opinion against the war and may have contributed to the downfall of President Richard Nixon. College students are like leaders in the forefront of protesting against the war, right? This is something that you see at IU as well. There was like a big defense contractor or somebody that came to IU during this time, and a bunch of students were arrested as well, some beaten by police. It was a big kind of thing that was reported on. This stuff is happening across the country at so many different universities. Jackson State University as well is experiencing more violence, and two students killed there as well. This is the kind of atrocities that I was talking about earlier. My Lai, right? So March 16th, 1968, American forces were searching for Viet Cong in a small village. Lieutenant William Cawley, he's leading this unit that is found to shoot and kill unarmed civilians. Approximately 500 citizens, innocent civilians, were raped, murdered, right? And, abused, brutalized. And again, these are all civilian, not to say that it would be any better if it wasn't a civilian, but to make it worse, it is civilians, right? Life magazine published his photos of this situation. Lieutenant William Cawley, in his trial, he's found guilty of killing 22 villagers on his own. He was originally given a life sentence, but due to corruption, obviously in the military, corruption in the way that our country operates, many times he only served 3.5 years under house arrest before being set free. Initially, 3 military members who tried to halt the massacre and rescue hiding civilians were shunned and even denounced as traitors in a U.S.-sponsored cover-up of the events. It wasn't until almost 30 years later that they were recognized for their role in attempting to save some of the civilians in this brutal massacre. They were dubbed baby killers because they killed infants. They killed infants, they killed children, they killed women, they killed men, anybody in the area, blindly going through and killing civilians, murdering civilians, right? Lieutenant Calley's found guilty. Again, like I said, that life sentence. You have Governor Edgar Whitcomb of Indiana asking that all state flags be flown at half staff for Calley out of respect and out of protest for the decision to give him life, right? So you see this happening as well. Nixon moves him to house arrest, even though he's been given life, and then he's paroled after 3 years of house arrest, and he's a free man. It's a huge, ridiculous tragedy and travesty of the way that the United States handles this situation. It's flat out what it is. It's murder. It's a massacre, and it's at the hands of the U.S. military. This is something that's talked about in the news. This, again, is also going to lead into more hate for the Vietnam War. This is fueling the fires of, like, we don't want to be in this war as the populace. Hugh Thompson, a helicopter pilot who tried to stop the massacre and reported it, said, "It looks to me like there's an awful lot of unnecessary killing." This is Lieutenant William Calley Jr., who is on the cover of Time magazine with the article titled "Who Shares the Guilt?" And this, it's ironic to me, especially in such close proximity to World War II, in the way that we, the way that we went through with the Nuremberg trials and talking about war crimes and all this different stuff, that these men are not prosecuted more highly. Because I know that one of the big arguments during the Nuremberg trials is, well, I was just following orders. And you can probably guess what the next thing is. Lieutenant Calley said, "I was ordered to go in there and destroy the enemy. That was my job that day. That was the mission I was given. I did not sit down and think in terms of men, women, and children. They were all classified as the same. And that's the classification that we dealt with over there, just as the enemy. I felt then, and I still do, that I acted as I was directed, and I carried out that order that I was given, and I do not feel wrong in doing so." So absolutely no remorse for a man who murdered 22 innocent civilians and then basically got away with it. Take that how you will.
And the people who tried to save the people, like the few, were shunned, and this man got free. That's just awful.
Absolutely. It's absolutely insane, But again, this is a situation that leads into, more opposition against the Vietnam War. Okay. We also have the Pentagon Papers, which is like a leaked document. So recall that Nixon is in charge of bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail and invading areas of Cambodia and going in and putting our troops in different places. Remember, he campaigned on the platform of, like, I want to get out of Vietnam, right? But arguably, Nixon is harder in Vietnam he goes harder in Vietnam than Johnson does, right? So, leaked report of evidence of how American leaders involved in the U.S. in Vietnam without informing the American people. More and more people are losing their trust in the government. It comes out that there's the whole bombing of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It comes out that we're invading areas in Cambodia, that we're doing all these different things, and people are not happy about that. This is one of the big things that further shifts public perception against the military, against U.S. involvement, and a lot of people say that this actually is part of the reason why eventually, obviously with the big scandal with Nixon, but it's another one of the reasons why Nixon's presidency kind of experiences a downfall. As far as American withdrawal, I give Nixon some credit. He does eventually get around to it, though he waits until the 1972 re-election, which forced him to bring the troops home, because you can't go ahead and campaign on the same thing twice. I will bring the troops home. And then the next election, you're like, I'm going to do it, right? You have to do it then, okay? So he starts to do it. United States, South Vietnam, North Vietnam, they get together, they sign the Paris Peace Accords, which effectively, technically ends the Vietnam War. U.S. troops start to withdraw. One of the longest, most unpopular foreign wars ever fought by the United States. It cost 58,000 American lives. As many, and this pales in comparison to the lives lost in Vietnam, as many as 2 million Vietnamese soldiers and civilians were killed during this battle, during this long war, right? So that is what's happening there. Nixon starts that withdrawal process. And finally, we get down to the last slide, which is where Saigon falls, right? The capital of South Vietnam, 1979, Saigon falls to North Vietnam. Vietnam is unified under one flag, and the U.S. Embassy is evacuated. There's still individuals there, even though the United States withdrew its military forces from Vietnam after signing the Paris Peace Accords. There's still about 5,000 Americans remaining, including diplomats still working in the U.S. Embassy. So from April 29th, and that's the image that's happening up here, from April 29th to April 30th, helicopters landed at 10-minute intervals in the embassy, including landing on the embassy roof, with some pilots flying for 19 hours straight. Over 7,000 people were evacuated, including 5,500 Vietnamese in less than 24 hours. That, my friends, is Unit 12, Johnson, Kennedy, in Vietnam. Does anybody have any questions about anything?
Could you go back to the first slide
Sure.
real quick?
Absolutely. Might take a minute. Hang on. Here we go. We're going. Hang on.
Sorry.
Oh, you're fine. I could do this way easier. This is just more fun for me. Here we go. We're getting there. This the one? This the one you need?
Yes. Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
Yes,
I'll
of course.
just take a picture of it so you can move on.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So, the only other thing that you guys have for today is if you go to your Canvas homepage, you can see there's the Unit 12 assessment. It's open note. Now remember, I did not assign a test. So what I did instead, it's a 7-question multiple choice quiz. It is worth 15 points. This is just a way of getting some test questions to you so that we can do some measure of what you're understanding. You have 2 attempts on it. Do that before the end of class. That is the only thing that I ask you. And then other than that, whatever free time you have, you can work on missing assignments. I know some of you have missing assignments for me. Many of you guys in here, those of you who come to online class and those of you who come in person are doing really, really well. And I know that I've gotten a hold of some of you and we've kind of talked about some plans. So if I haven't talked to you and you're not doing that well and you need help, please just get a hold of me. Talk to me. I'm not scary most of the time, especially not today. So it's Friday, right? All right. Sky, you're good to go. I'll see you next weekend. You have a good weekend. Or sorry, next week.